It's time now for Harm Reduction, heard every Tuesday at 7 p.m. with Will Beaton, Cutting Edge Radio, where we'll ask the questions others don't want to ask. Now here's your host, Will Beaton.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Harm Reduction Report. I am happy to be here talking to you. I am, again, reporting live from the Firebreak Farm in Grass Valley, California. I have had a wonderful time out here. I just have a week left. I am heading home a little bit earlier than I thought I was. Thought I'd be out here for 5 weeks. Turns out it'd be a little bit more, or a little bit less time. But let me tell you, I've learned a lot out here. So I'm in Nevada County. This is about 2.5, 3 hours out of San Francisco, northeast of Sacramento, up into the foothills of the Sierra Mountains. And there's a place that I've learned a lot about called San Juan Ridge. San Juan Ridge is basically a bit yet north of here. In the last episode or two, I kind of described that this interesting dynamic in Nevada County in regards to marijuana. So something to catch us up again that we learned is that just this year, January 1st of this year, California legalized recreational marijuana use. And so this has changed a lot, including the marijuana economics of this county. For example, a lot of people up on the ridge first settled there growing marijuana farms, illegal marijuana farms. And with the legalization, many of these farmers have gone out of business, basically, because with the new legal market, prices for marijuana have totally dropped. And this has resulted in a lot of farms which have supported families for 3 generations out here going out of business. And it's very interesting. And down here in South County, Nevada County, where Grass Valley and Nevada City sort of are, I'm sort of more south of that where we're staying, is one thing. But up on the ridge, that is what I'm learning is like the place, the ridge. This is where all the hippie stuff is sort of going down. And I just visited the ridge for the first time this weekend to attend the memorial of another elder in the psychedelic community who recently died. I am talking about Dale Pendell. Dale Pendell, I like saying it that way. I just watched a video of him saying it Pendel. Anywho, Dale Pendell was a poet, a writer. What I learned at his memorial, he's actually was a lot of other things too, and very, very interesting things. So I'm very grateful to be sharing with you a bunch of audio from his memorial. For those of you listening on the radio, you're going to hear about 50 minutes of the memorial, and then it'll hear a few minutes of Dale himself speaking when he was interviewed in a movie called DMT, A Spirit Molecule. You'll hear a clip of his interview there. I'll leave you with his words. For those of you listening online on the Sandbagger News YouTube channel or on the UND Psychedelic Club page, after the 56-minute mark, you'll hear about another hour from people sharing at Dale's wake, at his memorial, and then we'll cut to Dale's words to end it that way. Dale Pendell, he wrote the Pharmako trilogy of books, Pharmako Poeia, Pharmako Dynamis, and Pharmako Gnosis, which you'll hear about from the speakers, including Gary Snyder, one of the awesome beat poet dudes who in 1974 came to UND and spoke at the Writers' Conference. It's very, very interesting to me that I happened to arrive and be in California, to be in Nevada County and in San Francisco at the perfect time to attend both Dale's memorial and also the memorial of John Perry Barlow, which was the focus of last week's episode. That was really special to me. And what was very also interesting was realizing that a lot of the friends I made at the Barlow memorials last week in San Francisco, a lot of the same people were here on the ridge for Dale's memorial too. So it was really cool to follow up on the friendships and relationships I started last week and to see them here. And again, some of the people were like, aren't you from North Dakota? What are you doing here? It's like, well, I'm in the right place at the right time, I guess. And I'm very glad I was indeed. So now we're going to cut to a story about Dale Pendell, one of these elders of the psychedelic research community, and his life spent on the Ridge.
This was a place that was library, laboratory, meeting place, party spot, and a refuge for many, some of whom you'll probably hear from today, sitting right here before me. I always expected him to emerge from his study to announce that he had finally turned lead into gold. And I will say this, I think he did finally accomplish this old alchemical dream. Dale, I underestimated you always. I would like to, I have on my list for the first speaker who will tell us something good, I hope, is David Pendell, his brother, if he's here.
May the long time sun shine upon you, all love surround you, and the pure light within you guide you all the way on. May the long time sun shine upon you, all love around you, and that pure light within you guide you all the way on. Incredible string band. I love those guys. I was about 2 years old, a little more than that. Dad came up to me one day and said, "How would you like to have a little brother?" Why? Later on, he asked it again, and we both said, "Why?" Our father is a Methodist minister. Can you tell? Listening to what I heard earlier, I was going, oh yeah. I mean, we used to, when we got older, we'd sneak into church, Methodist minister, and we'd try to go in barefoot, just really to irk him, which he did, or it did. Irked the congregation more than him, perhaps. And then later on, as my wife says, when she first started visiting our house, that we were just unmerciful when it came to time to having Sunday dinner and talking about or critiquing Dad's sermon. So I'm here to give a little foundation about my brother, not the professional, not the ne'er-do-well, not the lover, later on friend to many. He turned out to be really a Renaissance man. I think in the finest sense of the word, we can all say that. Of all the individuals I have ever met, that speaks most directly to it. However, when he was a young boy, he was a younger brother and kind of a pain in the neck. Now, how many of you have younger brothers out there? How many of you have families with brothers in them? Yeah? Well, you know what I mean. You know, there's a certain amount of rivalry and stuff that goes on. Poor mother. I mean, 3 boys. Don't know how she did it. Well, 4. My dad was a boy, too. And then, as the 60s rolled around, one night he called me up, or one day, I was doing alternate service work for 2 years, and he said, "We're going to an acid test." I go, "What?" Well, I'd read about Leary. I sort of was excited about the concept. And so he and I went to one of the acid tests. Very interesting. Won't go into it, except I mean, didn't know what I was getting into. But after everything was over, and I don't know if he'd even be here, there was a friend of Dale's that he knew from UCLA, a young psychiatry professor, I believe, who was kind of helping some of us outside the main building at the later part of the evening. And so we were sort of out there getting some personal attention to calm us down a little bit. I walked back into where this event had happened, and everybody gone home. There was no one there, really. The soft glow of the house lights in this giant space were on, and a group of people sitting around an Indian rug chanting, and each person an individual, unique personality that just made me say, I want to be one of those, whatever that is. Shortly after that, I received a package in the mail from my brother, opened it up. Well, maybe I can't say this.
Probably okay.
It is California, right? Okay. I'm living in Utah, so it's really still a question. Received a package, and out of it came this sort of old-fashioned fountain pen. Well, why would my brother be giving me a fountain pen? Of course, I opened it up, and out came these vitamin C capsules. He was making his own LSD and sent me some samples to see how it was. This guy was always doing that stuff. But from time to time, it caught up with him. And I had the fear, the real fear, and he told me, I'll never live past 30. And I truly believed it. So when he turned 30, I reminded him of that, but not too loudly, because I was still not sure what was going to happen. And as some of you may know, there were many things that happened after that. Hermosillo prison, federal prison, other engagements with the underworld and various events in his life that gave us concern as to what would happen. I was so blown away by how he lived through that, how he developed all of these different interests that I never knew he had, created family and friends, invented things, and always looked into whatever question he could think of and tried to find the answer. And he lived more than double his 30 years. Oh. So there are many things we can talk about the foundation of Dale's life. I'm sure if my mother were here, she would say, boy, he was a hard one. But we'll leave that to private gatherings later. And I want to say to Laura and to Marisi, may the long time sun shine upon you, all love surround you, and the pure light within you guide you all the way on. Amen.
I was wondering if the prison history was going to come out, and there are actually quite a few details that could be told in that regard. At any rate, next speaker on the list here is Marina Bokelman.
I met Dale in the early months of 1969 when I moved to 525 Bay Street in Santa Monica, 5 blocks from the Pacific Ocean. 525 consisted of 2 small, shabby wooden duplexes set at a right angle to the sidewalk, with an even smaller duplex making a T at the back. We had a shared path leading from the sidewalk to the alley. The tenants were UCLA grad students, artists, and hippies. Dale lived in front in apartment A. I lived in tiny apartment F at the back. Shortly after I moved in, Dale appeared at my door. He stood in the middle of my room, tall and lean, with full beard and mustaches, his golden brown hair curling on his neck. A voice in my head said, "Brother." We were instant friends. I called him the man from the mountains for his habitual attire: jeans, high moccasins, vest worn over a long-sleeved shirt with cuffs turned back, and a sheath knife at his belt. He called me Herb Woman. We had both escaped limiting circumstances. I had just dropped out of the PhD program in folklore and mythology at UCLA. He was not long out of a Texas prison for smuggling, where he had gone through kick. He brought me his poems and read them aloud with a stutter. He told me about Bill Ebaugh, the mountain man who was hunted and killed in the wilds above Nevada City. He spoke of the sublime science of alchemy and of mercurius, the transformative substance essential for many processes in the alchemist's retort. He made jewelry from gold and silver pilfered from his job at B&T Metals, a heavy silver ring for his left hand, and an amulet, a solid silver chalice around which coiled a gold snake. This he wore on a thong around his neck. If you've read The Gold Dust Wilderness, you'll find that image of the chalice and the snake. When doctors said I would never bear children, he made me a gypsy fertility charm to wear as a pendant, a silver heart decorated with gold snake, gold and silver moons and stars, and blue turquoise at the center. I am wearing it now. He invited me to go petroglyph hunting, and from that moment we were sidekicks. We traveled everywhere in my VW bus, Old Coyote. Dale's researches took us to the high desert to look for petroglyphs, to the Gold Dust Mountains to interview old-timers, and to the Northwest Coast where a hoopah basket maker fed us acorn soup. I gathered herbs for medicine, and Dale collected botanical specimens for his plant press. We spent one New Year's Eve in Joshua Tree, so cold the water froze solid in the bucket. We slept on the bare ground, but after Dale bought a telephone lineman's truck, we had the luxury of a wooden bed. Every once in a while, one of us would say, ho, 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 Cisco, and the other would reply, ho, 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 Pancho. The first silk screens he showed me were Japanese pornographic line drawings. The first polychrome was a Shumash pictograph paired with the Bodhisattva vow. This set the stage for the magnificent silk-screened pages that make up his great masterpiece, The Gold Dust Wilderness. I embroidered a shirt for him. In colored threads, I created the cosmos and told the California Indian creation stories that were a shared part of our mind streams. You can see Dale's shirt in the schoolhouse, and maybe you can guess some of the stories. At some point, Dale moved to Santa Barbara, where he lived high up on San Marcos Pass in a tiny cabin. He slept under a bear skin. I gathered datura and other herbs for the smoking mixtures he was experimenting with at that time. I took a solo road trip in the summer of 1970, fell in love with the Great Smoky Mountains and decided to move there. But first I moved to San Francisco, where I got a job as a legal secretary. To save money, I lived for a year in a 12-foot diameter Army officer's tent in a friend's backyard in El Cerrito, hitchhiking to and from the financial district every day. By then, Dale had leapfrogged to Humboldt, but frequently visited. One time we attended the Black Hat ceremony performed by the 16th Karmapa. I am wearing the protection string now. Another time we rented a typewriter at the Berkeley Public Library, and I typed the manuscript for Kiowa #1. So yes, Jerry, it does exist. Sometimes we drove into the city for Bud's ice cream. He invited me to Humboldt, where we peddled Osceola Cola at a craft fair. He had blended the different cola flavors with alchemical subtlety. It was the very first flavored carbonated mineral water ever invented, and he grudged not having the backing to get it on the market. When I was ready to leave for North Columbia in late 1972, Dale asked if he could come with me as far as Boulder, where Chogyam Trungpa was leading a retreat. At the end of the retreat, I drove east to fulfill my dream of living in the Smokies. Dale returned to California, where he met Merle and fathered Marisi. Being friends with Dale was like looking in the mirror and seeing in the reflection a different version of myself. He created with words on paper. I created with embroidery floss on cloth. He was an ethnobotanist. I made granny medicine. He was a poet and writer. I was a singer. We were both avid researchers and read many of the same books. We both worked with symbols and respected the language of plants, animal helpers, and rock people. We shared a love for the Artemisias. We were companions on the path for a while. He was my brother.
Let's see. Next on the program is Gary Snyder, who I see stumbling down the trail here. I had no idea this many people knew Dale. This is wonderful. It's really wonderful. There's a couple of things I'd like to read because they're part of the record and they're part of the way they've contributed to being part of the way that he's known in the world. I'm going to read again, first I'm going to read again the foreword that I wrote to the Pharmako trilogy of books. This is a book about plants. And if you haven't gotten into that book, maybe you never will. But it's extraordinary. Green, sweet, peaceful plants. The harmless beings who give us flowers, nuts, fruits, roots, sap, bark, fiber, and shade. But some aren't so great to eat, sour, bitter, or worse. Plants are all chemists, tirelessly assembling the molecules of the world. And in their transactions with insects, birds, animals, and fungi, they find elaborate ways to defend themselves to seduce pollinators, to confuse. So these books are about the interplay of plants, insects, animals, and humans, and suggest a bit about how toxins shaped ecological systems, how much we assume about plants, and how little we know about them. Pendel playfully says, only plants had consciousness. Animals got it from them. It's a book about people, the plant women and the men who for millennia integrated the properties of plants and learned to use them for healing, for their effects on the mind, for poison. These ancient experts and traditional professionals knew and kept plant secrets close for generations. These are books about knowledge and secrets. In recent centuries, those who knew plants and their powers have often been stigmatized as though danger and unpredictability were of themselves evil. It's a book about human cultures and how those which demonize death or periodic sickness are thus less able to deal with the bitter side of nature, with intoxications, and make themselves doubly sick. The Buddha taught that all life is suffering. We might also say that life, being both attractive and constantly dangerous, is intoxicating and ultimately toxic. Cupid shoots an arrow which strikes and changes you forever. Love is toxic. Toxic comes from toxikon in Greek, Pendel tells us, with a root meaning a poisoned arrow. All organic life is struck by the arrows of real and psychic poisons. This is understood by any true, that is to say, not self-deluding, spiritual path. So Pendel speaks of the way of poisons. This way, modern and ancient, shamanism and herbcraft, verging into ethnobotany and ethnopharmacology, has developed a remarkable body of empirical and scientific knowledge to place against the current official ignorance and resistance to the possibility of clear and courageous thinking about the many realms of drugs. These are books about danger, dangerous knowledge, even more dangerous ignorance, and dangerous temptations by the seductions of
additional, both psychic and cellular. It's a book which, these are books which require that one not be titillated by romantic ideas of self-destruction. And I hope and believe that it will benefit human beings and the plant world both, for everyone. And it's not for everyone, but then neither is mountaineering. Pendel quotes William Blake, "Poets are of the devil's party." Poets, needless to say, are not Satanists, so what does Blake mean? I think he is saying that for those who are willing to explore the fullness of their imagination, their mind, and their senses, there are great risks, at the very least, of massive silliness. This is easy to lose. Farther out, there is madness, no joke. But forget about the devil poets, and such travelers also bring a certain sanity back home. Here are the books that look at half-understood truths and serious territories of remaining mystery, imagination, and poetry. Industrial toxins and wastes are in the air and oceans and buried and heaped up through all the land. Our very food now seems suspect. Better living through chemistry was brought out by our own entrepreneurial and selectively regulatory virtues. The developed world now has to work with all these questions and work it out with environmental destruction as the stake. Who indeed are the crazies of the 19th and 20th centuries? We desperately need to understand the basics of plants, of the consciousness of poisons, and these books are a tentative map with scribbled reports by scouts from the territory beyond the margins, and it aims for sanity. Thank you. I wrote that for the first volume, and it was carried over to all three of those volumes. And then another text, much later. Acharya, Dale Pendell. This is my memory of the way he came into my life and to some of our lives. He arrived on San Juan Ridge visiting a friend of Chuck Dockham and Marion Lincoln's, Steve Sandfield, Joel Goodkind, and their circle. Years later, Chuck and Marion had picked it, years before, Chuck and Marion had picked him up hitchhiking on Highway 1, and they had all become friends. When I first met Dale, he gave me a copy of what I think was his first book of poems called The Gold Dust Wilderness. Some months spent in the Klamath or Marble Mountains ranges on the North Coast, a rare handmade book. After a few years, he ended up here and began sitting with the Zen group that I was shaping in those days. The Zendo was my barn, very chilly in winter, even with the stove going, but high-spirited. Joel Goodkind was married to Merle, but she hit her limit with him and told him to leave. Eventually, Dale married Merle, moved in there, and that was stable for quite a long time. Merle's son by Joel, Isaac, died in a snowboard accident. She had another child with Dale, Marichi. Dale was a stalwart of the ordering that took place to accommodate Robert Aitken when he began visiting here to lead sessions occasionally. I had been corresponding with Aitken for a number of years before he finally turned up as part of a trip to visit his parents near Placerville. He had received transmission from his lay Japanese teacher Yamada only recently, and so I invited him to visit us. His traditional Honolulu Sangha is part Rinzai and part Soto Zen, and is not based on monastery training. Nelson was Aitken's lead disciple even then. So it happened that Nelson and Robert's visits and the sessions here took over the local Sangha style. I decided to step back from the local Zen practice entirely and to work on finishing my long poem, Mountains and Rivers Without End. And that's another story. Dale had a fascinating life history, including growing up in the ambience of the mega church his father organized and preached at, and then some youthful years in Mexican and American prisons because of his interest in hard drugs. When I first knew him, one of his territories was mathematics and its further reaches. I tried to follow him a few times, late past midnight, sitting by the campfire, as he tried to explain all this to me, and the glimpses alone of themselves were remarkable. He and I set up CB radio sets with antenna up in the trees, and also in my truck, and sometimes when on the road, I would call him, he would call my wife Masa on a two-way radio, and she and I would talk through both. Kurt Lorenz and Dale played nightly chess games on the CB. The CB for a while was all over San Juan Ridge and in our cars, and we all had handles. Merle's health was not good, and when her lupus turned even worse, and it seemed that they must move toward town, Dale reinvented himself as a computers person and got good professional employment in San Jose. They bought a house in Santa Cruz. They were there for some years. Dale began his long research on psychoactive plants, which resulted in the remarkable trilogy of books Pharmacopoeia, Pharmacognosis, Pharmacodynamics. These are known to specialists, ethnobotanists, ethnopharmacologists. He published a number of books of poetry and a long science fiction novel called The Great Bay, which I am very taken with, but it seems to be little known. He kept up his connection with the local Zen practice by occasionally attending mountains and rivers sessions, and it was on one of those walks, somewhere in Death Valley, I believe, that he met Laura, a Sangha visitor, and they eventually became a couple. Merle's health worsened, and eventually she died. Her ashes are on Bald Mountain, as are Chuck's and several others, including my mother's. Eventually, Dale, with Laura, returned to the area, but chose to live where they are now, which is along Indian Springs Road between Penn Valley and McCourtney, an area of large pastures with many cows and horses at about 1,100 feet elevation. Aitken and Nelson later became possibly a little estranged from Dale for different reasons. I have not investigated that territory. Dale also wrote a small book on the Burning Man celebration, possibly the most astute of the many out there, and it has no photographs. Which is amazing. His medical problems go back for years. Hepatitis C, and then his liver took such a bad turn that he was told it would have to be replaced. Nothing else would work. Remarkably, he made a connection with a young man with the right age and the right type, who volunteered, actually just plain volunteered, to let him have part of his liver. Dale was tentatively recovering, but then he turned up with bone cancer in the spine. It was this that made him seriously think about death. A few years back, I started calling Dale Acharya. Part in play, but really meaning it. That's an old Sanskrit word that is a title for a person who is deeply skilled in science, yoga, math, magic, and self-knowledge. Bigger, in a way, even than Zen. May his remarkable karma enliven us all.
Ooh.
So I told more history there than I had meant to, and some of that maybe most of you knew, but maybe some of it was new to you. So there it is.
Thank you.
Oh.
Thank you, Gary. It would appear that there's not much else to tell. I don't know. At any rate, our next speaker is Marisi, and you will notice that she has some resemblance to someone who is familiar to us all.
It's wonderful to see so many people here, and I'm especially touched that so many of the family came from far, far away. I thank you. Many of you out here were present the last time I spoke at North Columbia Schoolhouse. I was 20-something years ago, alongside my Ridge Kid peers. I was still processing my brother's death, and I read an essay that I wrote about my brother and Kurt Cobain. This time, I'm sharing about my father. All of my immediate family members are dead, so hopefully the next time I'm here, we can celebrate something much more positive. Many people today will speak about my father's writings and the last 15 to 20 years of his life. I want to share aspects of my father that most people really didn't get to see, or at least didn't see as clearly as I did. Before my father decided to be a shaman and write esoteric books about psychotropic plants, he was an accomplished software engineer. Debugging code suited his meticulous nature. He's the only person I know, save maybe Uncle Howard, who would stay up all night to crack the combination of a lock, just to do it. When I was in elementary school, I was obsessed with maps. I took learning the state capitals to extremes, and my dad, maybe tired of quizzing me, I don't know, he decided to write a computer program to quiz me. So I can take credit for his first computer game. He had me write the text, I had to do all of the research and write the questions, and he wrote the code. Had my mother and I known how successful he was going to be with this, we probably would not have been so supportive of his next computer game, Empire. Family members know that one. It's quite an obsessive thing. One of the staple stories about my father's rebel youth, this is before the prisons, was getting kicked out of the UCSB dorms for making beer. In reality, it had much more to do with political posters in the windows, but the dean of students blamed it on the beer. A few months before my tenure at UCSB, and when I graduated, that was the first time he'd stepped back foot on that campus, he and I brewed beer together. Being my father, it couldn't just be any beer. It had to be medicinal. We made a wormwood IPA. Yeah, you laugh, you didn't try it. I loved every second. Even with him expositing about the fermentation process in language that I had no concept what he was saying, it was still wonderful. Until it came time to try the beer. So when we did go to bottle the beer, we used the old capper that he used in the Osceola soda making days. It was a gift from his maternal uncle, Alvin. As we decanted the brew, the kitchen filled with the intensity of double hops and wormwood. Yeah, we use both. Giddy with excitement and so thrilled to try what I was hoping would be a delicious and an economical way of drinking beer. We got ready and then we tasted it, and it was the most disgusting thing ever. My mom snapped a picture and both of us were like, there's a picture in the schoolhouse. And we were trying so hard to stay positive. Well, maybe it'll get better with age. Maybe if we cut it with something really light, it'll be palatable. No. 10 years later, when we were cleaning out my basement, we found cases of the stuff. And we're sitting there going, oh my gosh, what do we do with this? And it was kind of heartbreaking, but we took it to the dump. I would love to have had our beer taste phenomenal, but it really makes a much better story the way it turned out. When I think back on doing homework, specifically math homework, I actually have happy memories, despite my barely passing grades in math. Nightly, my dad and I would sit together at the table and do homework together, along with our cat. We called him the algebra cat. We would sit there for hours every night, going through every single problem. My dad didn't just explain the problems, he customized the word problems into baseball statistics so that I had a tangible reference for what was happening with the decimals, the fractions, and the dreaded word problems. All of a sudden, these word problems didn't seem so scary because they were about batting averages and ERAs and slugging percentages, which I understood completely. Unfortunately, he couldn't be there when I was taking my tests. In later years, when I was away at college, I would still call him almost every night, and he would walk through the whatever math homework and then later my chemistry homework. We had really high phone bills. The only time he ever was a bit frustrated was when I would call him right in the middle of baking something and say, Dad, how do you half 2/3 of a cup? And he would try to go through and explain, and I'd say, I don't want the lowest common denominator, I just want to know how to do it right now, I'm baking. That's the only time he got frustrated. But it wasn't only math that he taught me. A drive or a walk would turn into the most extensive history lesson, but not just about history, about the culture, the plants, the animals, from the Ice Age to the present. It made it so that even a drive through the barren desert, which would be pretty boring for me as a teenager, came alive, and it was wonderful, and I have vivid memories of those drives together. I was really bitterly disappointed later when not everyone taught history the way my dad explained it to me. As many of you know, my father never had just a passing interest in anything. He dedicated his entire being to a topic, and everyone else was along for the ride. Just ask Laura about rocks or stamps or the Plantagenet rulers of England. Actually, that one was my fault. My dad had the most amazing memory, better than photographic, because he synthesized everything that he read. He was able to access everything he ever read as simply as pulling a file from his brain. When I was in the hospital recovering from spinal surgery, my cousin Alicia walked into the room with my dad, and he was expounding on Gettysburg, which is one of his passions. After he left the room, she leaned over and she said to me, I just learned more about the Civil War in the walk from the car than I ever did in school. And thinking about it now, I have to agree with her. The basis of my entire breadth of knowledge, I owe to him. No matter the subject, he was my first resource. Thankfully, he was a reliable resource, most of the time. One time he was going on and on about prehistoric civilizations living under the earth. In tunnels, I asked? No, in the earth, he continued. After a while, I noticed that his eyes were gleaming. And I asked, Dad, are you pulling my leg? Yeah, I totally fell for it. And he said, you can't believe everything I say. He dropped just enough of the facts and the prominent names to make everything believable. Steve Sanfield once cautioned me from believing everything that my father told me. And at the time, I was astounded. Like, what? What do you mean, not believe him? He says everything. It's true. Then I learned. When I recounted that story to my father, he said, I don't know everything. I just know enough to be dangerous. Well, I don't think dangerous. Intimidating and awe-inspiring, maybe, but not dangerous. My father and I worked best when it was just the two of us. Our bond forged when I was very young, and my mom was in and out of the hospital. And when my mom wasn't in the hospital, she still wasn't well. She was often lying on the couch, resting. So when she was resting, I would go into my dad's office, and I would sit on the couch. He was at his typewriter. I would sit on the couch and eat his peanuts. He always had peanuts. Throughout my childhood and into my adulthood, I found great comfort sitting in my father's office. Often we didn't talk, both quietly working on our own, sharing interesting tidbits here and there. It is those times that I will miss the most. The world has all of his books to savor and enjoy and worship, but for me, I will cherish those moments alone in his office. Thank you.
Jake, you're up. Jake Freydon. I knew Dale all my life, and later in life we found ourselves very simpatico, probably because we were both druggies, though I think Dale liked to think of himself as a wizard and a shaman. We both moved back to Nevada County about 15 years ago, and it was at this time that Dale was very interested in absinthe and introduced us all to the Green Fairy, which made him great at parties. And we would always check in at Halloween and May Day or Burning Man, and he would tell me what he was working on writing-wise. And I took a lot of pleasure when he named a minor character in the Great Bay after me. But my real memories of Dale come from the early 70s, when he was married to Merle, and we were, I was best friends with his stepson Isaac, and we spent a lot of time running around naked in that little house down on Lake City Road, which was very beautiful on the edge of a meadow, and just archetypal, and I often return there in dreams, actually. And for some reason, that house is associated in my mind with The Who's Tommy, which we must have gone to see probably way too young. And then I just remember standing around trying to understand that movie. But I remember three things very specifically about Dale from that time. The first was, of course, his stutter, which was so intense. And as a young kid, 7 or 8 years old, I'd never encountered a disability like that. And it was mysterious and made everything he said have such great weight because it was so hard for him to say it. It must have been very important. So I always kind of wondered what was the karma or the reason behind that stutter, and I have some theories that I'll get to in a second. The other thing he was the Osceola Cola, which if you never drank it, you don't know how good it was. It was just delicious, and again, at the time, there was nothing else on the market like it, and we all thought he was going to be rich and famous from that. And any party you went to, there was bottles of it, and it was at Mother Truckers, so we were all surprised when Hanson's showed up and stole his market from him, and I guess he didn't have the resources to go big with it. But the thing I remember most about Dale was one afternoon when he gathered all the kids from the neighborhood, and again, we're about 10 years old, and he gave us a chess lesson. And there was probably 10 of us there, and he taught us one thing, which was how to finish the game, how to use a king and a queen to beat a king. And he showed us step by step, and then he had all 10 chessboards in a circle, and he played against us, each of us. And Not only did I really learn how to do that, and every time I play chess, those skills come back, but for me, that was just the most incredible intellectual feat I'd ever seen. He played 10-year-old kids at chess. This winter, we interviewed Dale on videotape, and he was in a little discomfort and a little rambly, but we did get him to tell some of his favorite stories and some of the early stuff. When I do an interview like that, I always want to try to understand the person. I want to know who the parents were, what early childhood was like. But Dale didn't really want to talk about that much. And he wanted to talk about his formative experiences, which for him was nature. And he talked a lot about the canyons of San Diego where he grew up and finding God and nature out there. And I think this was the beginning of his shamanism. And for me, in my mind, somehow his stutter was Dale found a profound truth at an early age. And he was in a very strict, traditional, mainstream situation, and nobody wanted to hear that truth who was around him. And I think he had a hard time getting it out when he was younger. For me, what we are going through now is the end of the 60s. We had, my mom's memorial, we had Steve Sanfield's memorial, we've had so many others, and each of these people is so unique and irreplaceable. And part of that is just the circumstances they came from, where they had to rebel so hard, and that defined, who they were for a long time. Second generation hippies, we don't have to work so hard to be individualistic, it just kind of comes naturally. But the world has changed and is changing, and a lot of the 60 values continue, but we won't have another Dale, and I'll miss him.
I actually made my remarks deliberately short because I wasn't really sure how much was supposed to come out in public. And it would seem like it's just about all out there, but including the stuttering. Should we mention the stuttering? Anyway, beautifully done. And Susan, I was supposed to, you were wrongly submitted here in the order. So please, Susan Sundry.
Oh. So happy to be here, not because Dale is gone, because it's a joy to gather with his family and friends. And I hope I don't cry, but I probably will.
Go ahead.
Dale, let me begin. Let me just do this right. So there's a quote about chants from Dale's book, The Language of Birds. In it he says, "Chance is creative, a subtle propensity for change, swerve, the clinamen of Epicurus and Lucretius, an inclination, grain of wood, desert varnish on sandstone, the affinity of things." I refer to this quotation to explain to myself how this complex, profoundly important relationship that I had with Dale for 44 years. How did that happen? It was such a chance meeting, and it seemed to continue in that manner for such a long time with such great benefit to me. I'll tell you a little bit about it. So I met Dale in the fall of 1974. Maurice was just a few months old at the Lake City Cat Road cabin, and it was like this. Philip and Sean, who's not here, and I had retired from our jobs at Modesto Community College and got our rig, well, we started off with a 57 Chevy with a camper on the back, but traded that in for a pop-top camper. And we were looking for land. Really, we were looking at land, but we did a great deal of looking. Ultimately, we needed a place to, stop and rest. So Philip had a friend named Jeff Evans who had this house in the hills on Cragmont that he was renting rooms in. So we rented a room and had a place to crash when we got off the road. And one day, a guy moved into one of the other rooms, this bearded guitar-playing lawyer named Paul Roberts. And he took one look at us and he said, you need to meet my client. You'll like each other. Well, who's your client? A guy named Dale Pendell. Sure, why not? So we'd already been on the Ridge because we had met Gary at a poetry reading, and he'd invited us to Get Dizzy. So we kind of knew where that was. So we made the arrangement, and we drove on out. And I, for some reason, I have a vivid memory of driving down the driveway off Lake City Road into that beautiful little cabin with a garden on the side. And it was sunny, and this tall man comes out and looks at us, but he won't talk. So who is this dude? And he has this beautiful wife, and she's very friendly, and the little baby, and Isaac, who's just a little bit younger than Sean. And from that somewhat inauspicious beginning, just this most marvelous friendship developed and went on for 44 years. One of the ways that I know Dale is as an entrepreneur, and I'll share a couple of little notes that you may not know. Okay, we left the house on Cragmont and moved to apartment on California Street in Berkeley, and that soon became a point on the geography of the Poets Roadway. So people coming in and out of town, we'd see them, and of course we saw Dale and Merle and Maurice, Isaac, on a regular basis passing through. And one day Dale came in and he has got this great idea. Well, we'd seen his flavor lab because when we met him, he was doing Osceola Cola, and it was probably the very first natural cola and root beer. And I mean, it had a hard time staying in the bottle, I just have to tell you. It was constantly on their back porch popping out of the bottle. But so what, it was great. But he'd sold the business, and he had a new idea. Well, I totally trusted him. That flavor lab was impressive. Get this, flavored mineral water. Good idea, huh? So he wanted us, the two of them were going to go into business with the two of us, and we said, yeah. So Philip came up with the name Glacia, and we were looking at labels and paper and all. We took this great trip up to Calistoga to meet the guys up there who had been involved in Osceola, and they said, that's a very good idea, sure. Well, unfortunately, Dale had a non-compete clause in his contract when he sold Osceola. And he was sure, he told us about it, he was sure he could modify that. Sure of it. And we worked on it, and he worked on it, and he worked on it, and he couldn't change it. And we had to let it go. Very shortly thereafter, guess who's coming out with flavored mineral water? Well, as they say, the rest is history. Well, that one got away. Meanwhile, about the same time, Dale proposed to Philip and I to join with them in buying the Steger land. Their cabin was on the Steger land. The Steger brothers were an old mining and ranching family in Nevada County. It was a big piece of property, and Dale's idea was to divide it in quarters. So I think Rance and Greta were going to be one of the other couples. I don't remember who the fourth one was that was ever secured, but we said, of course, sure. And so Dale did the negotiating. It was his business deal. And we negotiated for over a year. And then I was pregnant with Calafia. It's like, we kind of got to make a move here, got to have some decisions made. And the Steger brothers' wives fell into a war with one another, ostensibly over quitclaims of some sort, but God knows what it was really about. And the Steger brothers, according to Dale, were aghast, and they couldn't get those women to budge, and they couldn't sell. So not shortly before Calafia was born, that deal fell through, and of course, we moved to our house in Grass Valley. But through all that negotiating and great business ideas, there was the Primitive Arts Institute, one of the most wonderful things I've ever participated in. And it began this way. In 1975, Marcia Stone and Jillian Hodge were working for Sierra College and teaching weaving and, in Jillian's case, ceramics. And their supervisor came to them one day and said, this is so successful. I think Sierra College should do a Primitive Arts Institute. Can you invite some of your friends to join us and we'll produce it? So they asked Dale to do poetry and me to do masks and ritual drama, and we were all set and ready to go, and then the funding fell through. Well, we secured a small grant, $1,500 from the California Arts Council, because we loved the idea, and we produced the first Primitive Arts Institute in 1976 at Malakoff Diggins State Park over 2 weekends. And it was a wonderful success, and we went, wow, we love this, let's do this. And it was amazing how the four of us, how well we got along, how well we negotiated. So we immediately took out the papers to become a nonprofit. Well, of course, that means you have to keep the books. I mean, you have to be like a business. Thankfully, Dale was right there with his great skills. I have some of the ledgers, and I have the archive. It's in his, crabby little handwriting, but it's all in great detail. He made sure we stayed good with the state, and and then we got paid, and all our teachers got paid. It was because of Dale. I mean, I couldn't have done that. He did a great job. He was our rock that way. Anyway, here's what Dale said about what we were doing. We had to say, what's the Primitive Arts Institute? And he said this in an interview with the Western Slopes Connection in 1977. Dale said, what is the primitive? And he said, quote, original, the first way, the old way. In poetry, with the original function of poetry as a magical discipline. In the old way, poets had a strong relationship to their community. And that set the stage for what we really did attempt to do. We had many artists so we did primitive arts in 1976, and then again in 1977 for 5 days at Malakoff Diggins State Park. Oh, right. So we did 1978, but we got a little lazy. I have the notes. We actually lost money on that one. And I have the notes from our meeting at Jillian's where she calls it the autopsy. What did we do? I mean, we did it, and it was fine, but it wasn't like it should have been, and it was really our fault. So then we took 1979 off, and in that year we did a mini primitive arts for one of the school districts, Liz Lucas was one of the teachers, and she loved it, and we all went and did primitive arts with the students, a big community of students and parents. That was great. But we pulled together, we got a good sized grant, $3,500, from the California Arts Council, and we did had a fabulous event in 1980. Many artists joined us. We learned to weave by beginning with shearing the sheep. We learned to create ceramic arts by digging the clay, carving soapstone by finding the stone. Gary organized one year a reading of the Ainu myth by firelight, utterly memorable, and another year the Mongol myth with various readers by firelight. We played the gambling game almost every night. Food was great. We had Maidu artists, Smokey Jones and Frank LaPena, for some teaching and performing. We had an African-American musician, the late Keith Jefferson. Jim Anderson did children's theater. Phil was a sweat lodge leader, and one year the Kuksu mosquito in full paint with this great pointy mask. It's a great picture. We had people of all stripes. We had the developmentally disabled. We had people in wheelchairs. We had people of all ethnicities. We wanted everybody there, a real community. Young, old. The children had they were not babysat. They had creative arts workshops, as did the older children before they graduated into the adult classes. And then the finale, of course, was everybody performing from their workshops. Utterly memorable. Many people here may have been at one of those primitive arts. I suspect it may be true. And people at those workshops forged relationships that they've kept to this day. Dale said in that same interview in the Western Slopes Connection in 77 about really the essence of what we were doing. He said, quote, "We wanted to create a place where the magic that happened among us in an informal way, day to day, could be opened up to others." And by all accounts, that is what we did. In the finale at Jackson Meadows, with 140 people in the forest under the stars around the campfire, the Primitive Arts, that was our last year, unfortunately. Everything changes. And it's you can see in the marvelous posters. Dale also designed those posters, as well as being our stalwart treasurer, poet, teacher, and plant teacher. I visited Laura. Well, let me just say that Dale was my brother on the path. It came to me fairly early on that that's our bond. For whatever reason, it was complicated, but that was what was at the heart and soul of this long relationship. A couple of memories that I hold so dear. One of them is at the Santa Cruz house in Myrtle Street, where after dinner we would often set to in what I call Irish conversations. That is, we were arguing. And to argue with Dale, you had to know your stuff, or at least to have enough stuff together that you could put up a good front. And he set such a wonderful high bar for me. I benefited from it enormously. And I remember those conversations with great joy. For me, it was utterly fun. It was just so much fun. Usually it evolved into dancing or drinking absinthe, which of course, as we know, he created. And he also created really delicious flavored spirits. Like I had a bottle of his plum. Oh my gosh, it's absolutely delicious. And of course, he was trying to market it, but that somehow or other didn't work out. I visited Laura and Dale over many years in Oakland and then, of course, in Penn Valley. And then we read together many, many times, the last time at Beyond Baroque in LA. And then Julia Connor, Jim Anderson, and Dale and Laura and I started meeting a few years ago to have creative conversations over dinner. It was wonderful. And then we had a ceremony for Dale just before he went for his transplant. And it was a year ago, last weekend, that we celebrated his birthday. Very memorable evening. And it's hard for me to say the depth of connection and affection that I held for Dale. I'm going to close with his words. This is a few lines from his poem, The Lotus Sutra, in his book, Salting the Boundaries, from 2014. In this poem, he says, "Today I saw a bay stretching blue to the horizon. Now I cannot see or hear or speak. Perhaps I am a nebula. I am certainly a poem. I am not I. Ah, I am not you, or am I? When you stop to lift a leaf, I am you. I am not you. Though I would make you I would pluck a string on a fine guitar, and you and I could be found in the sound of the string together. I am a dream."
Daniel Schulke. Daniel.
I'm the director of Three Hands Press, who published several of Dale's pieces. And I met him in the early 90s when I lived in Santa Cruz, and I was also publishing a small journal called Widdershins. I had a housemate who, like myself, took a certain interest in horticulture, and in particular, outlaw horticulture. At the time, I was going to Cabrillo College for an Associate of Science in Horticulture, and I was also working in the psychiatric field, treating dual diagnosis patients, which were Axis 1 mental health with drug addiction. And my housemate said, we should form a group to discuss psychoactive drugs. Are you in? I said, sure, it sounds good. I didn't know anybody the first day except the guy that organized it. And it begins with everybody go around the circle and say why you're here. And we had quite a crew. We had a cardiothoracic surgeon. We had an exotic dancer. We had several UCSC professors. We had a lot of young ravers. And we had a lot of old-time gardeners that had been in Santa Cruz for decades. I didn't know anybody except my friend who organized this. So people went around the room and they said, I'm really interested in collecting pods. Pods? Yeah, I brought some henbane pods. Would anybody like any? Oh, careful, don't squeeze them too hard. You can prick yourself. Another one would say, I'm interested in cultivation. Several of the folks said, I just want to get high. And I really didn't know if I should be there or not. But, you know, when it came my time, I said, I'm interested in the spirit dimension of plants. I'm interested in how they've been used in various occult, spiritual, and religious systems over the centuries. And then a couple people down from me, there was Dale. And I'm glad that people mentioned the stutter, because I think he really did. He did work that. And it's not just about what you say, it's about timing, and it's about knowing how to make the very best use of the time that you have. And there was, of course, you know, that powerful pause, and then he said, I'm interested in plants as allies. And I thought to myself, I'm in the right group. This is going to be good. And he goes, because I'm writing this book. Would anyone like to hear some of it? And everyone's like, sure. And so he proceeded to read the latest thing that he had written, probably about a couple of days before. And this was the unedited version. And it's the first thing I remember about Dale, the power of who he was constellated in my mind. And it was from his chapter on ethyl ether. It was a substance that I was very familiar with from my days when I lived in Texas. And he began to read, and he said, an angel is boiled in satanic acid, but the atmosphere that arises must be of heaven, not hell. For in hell, with all its sparks and flames, ether would explode instantly. And I thought to myself, how is it that a man can talk about a stupefying agent using poetry, Christian eschatology, medieval demonology, and physics? I want to know more. And so that was the beginning of the Peninsula Psychoactive Drug Research Group. And the idea was, each week we would go away and study a plant. Study, you know what I mean? And then come back and report with first-hand observations of what we had studied. And with every meeting, Dale would, of course, read the latest from Pharmako. Now, one of the things about Dale that, you know, I don't think has been mentioned yet is that he was very into the concept of sharing. The sharing was, for him, I would say a kind of mysticism, religion, what you call it. But he always spoke of Eve as the saint who shared, the one who dared. And it was that sharing nature that Dale had that was so important to us younger folk in Santa Cruz. And we might be hiking along Waddell Creek, for example, and he would begin talking about the chemical constituents of Umbellularia californica, the California bay laurel. Fortunately, I had something to reply to that with, which was about how to prepare the Ganoderma oplanatum fungus that grew at its base for a medicine. So, being both herbalists, we clicked very quickly. And over the years, this sharing was really reciprocal, and it was one of the first times in my life that I had met an elder who was also a teacher and a peer. Like, just sharing, I'm sure some of you know, sometimes it could clear a room. If you started getting into the finer details of plant taxonomy, you'd see people's faces, glaze over, and before you knew it, it was just Dale and I in the room. So you had to watch on nerding out on that effect. I remember when he was getting ready to move from Oakland, and he called me up and he said, we're going to be gone in a few days, and these plants need a home. Do you have a home for them? And I said, sure. So I showed up and dug up a lot of his plants and proceeded to put all my horticultural knowledge to use, and propagated a garden which I continue to maintain and use as medicine in some of the ways that he taught me. That's another example of how his spirit of sharing has continued to go out and influence people in the world even when he's not aware of it. Now, I'd like to share a final thought about Dale. In some contexts, the word necromancy might be considered distasteful at a memorial. But I think we're okay here. Necromancy as the art of conjuring the dead and getting advice from them. It's an oracular type of magic. And of course, Dale was very interested in oracles, and he's very interested in necromancy also. I'm proposing that everything that we're doing here is more than simply a memorial. We are calling back, enlivening, embodying, and furthering the life that is Dale. At the time that he passed, which I didn't know, I knew shortly thereafter, but it just so happened that I was dreaming about him. And I was dreaming of him becoming expansive and moving up among the stars. And his spirit took refuge in the constellation of Ophiuchus, the serpent bearer. And all those lights tessellated his wisdom on earth. Not just how to hold the serpent, but how to be an ally with it. How to use its poison and not get bit. And if you get bit, how to survive. But it wasn't just the stars of the heavens that I experienced Dale and his spirit becoming. It was the stars that came to earth. And that is the linkage that he has with each one of us here. A little bit of starfire from his soul to yours will go on from this point. His story must be told, his songs must be sung, and become part of our own individually. And so the stars of the earth would be populated as the stars of the heavens. This is my dream of his passing, and it is what I remember of him at the very last, before I saw him. And with that, I would like to close and wish him a happy birthday and rebirthday. Thank you, Dale.
Harrison.
Hello, and thank you, Laura, for inviting me to come speak at Dale's memorial. Dale and I met in 1992 in Mexico, and our paths crisscrossed a few times over the years until about 96, I think it was, when he moved up to Sonoma County, outside of Santa Rosa, the east part of the county. And I had been living in Sonoma County for a long time. Excuse me. And our friendship deepened there. And we spent a couple of years hanging out at times and stepping back at times, and we never were lovers. We were friends, but I have to say, of all the handful of eccentric courtships that I've experienced in my life, the phase of that when he was courting me was really the most Victorian, I think, of anyone. It was, I think, because we were in a time of transition, and it's become more clear to me just listening to the stories of other people today. A time of transition. My marriage had ended, and I was trying to figure out what the next step of my life was. His had ended, and we each had children, and we each had a background as outlaws, and a deep love and a lot of experience of the big powerful plants and mushrooms, and wondering about these traditions. Mine was more with indigenous people, and his with all the things you know about. But we kind of, I think we intuited our way at first, and then decided to explore the subtle together and to really take our shared love of looking at nature, listening, of smelling nature, and then of describing it in the most delicate terms, and to share that with each other, to develop our love of the subtle, of the observation, the delicate observations, and then to share them with each other. And it was a really sweet friendship and transition, and a time of grounding, really, in a life. Just my life, like his, had really big and dramatic themes in it at times, and so I got to know him for 25 years. But that time, that couple of years in there, when really I think he was conjuring the next phase of his life, and the next muse, and the next wonderful woman who would come along to be his partner with it. Fortunately, Laura did come along, and I was doing the same. And we just partnered in that quest and understanding and the use of language during that time. So we walked in the hills of the eastern Sonoma County where he lived, and really took a close look, like at this moment when the black oak is flowering, and when the Oregon oak was dropping its acorns, and the manzanita and the wild iris, and the moments when plants would change and present them to us, we tried to notice. And then we'd walk over in the West County where I lived, and under the redwoods and the violets, and out on the coast with the angelicas and artemisias, and invoke those names and those spirits that were in those plants as well. And I'd had a dear teacher, a native Californian teacher, who had told me about the place on the coast, on the Sonoma coast, a promontory where the coast Miwok from the Marin County and southern Sonoma County coast, and the Kashayapomo from the northern Sonoma County coast would come to meet. And this happened right up into the 1920s, he told me. They would come to meet each year in September, and on a certain day to mark their boundary. And they had done it for longer than anyone could remember, to mark their peaceful boundary, to mark their permeable boundary, to mark the place that was always agreed on as the edge, but then also to grant permission to cross over and cross back again. And that was partly an acknowledgement of their abundance that they each had to share, and it was an acknowledgement of their peaceful exchange and of the place itself. And they're out on that point, and my old teacher had taken me to this place. It's called Doctor's Point, or the old name is Doctor's Point, because Northern California Native people often called their healers and their shamans doctors. Women, as much or even more than men, were doctors. And so out on Doctor's Point, I told Dale about that, and he was so moved by the idea of a place that marked a boundary, and a place that people would go to quietly celebrate that on this cyclical basis, that he asked me to take him, and he planned a ritual for that. So we went out to that place, and there's a shallow cave there, and we hunkered down in that cave, and you can see way up the coast, from the mouth of the cave, way up the coast, and way down the coast, Point Reyes and all that, and straight out to the glittering sea. And we smoked some tobacco, which we used to do to mark our awareness, to mark these moments. And we said an invocation, and we acknowledged our permeable boundary, and thought about all the ways and what that meant in the rest of our lives. And he said something which later I saw showed up in this book, Living with Barbarians, that he published in 1999. He said something about every carbon atom in our bodies has at one time passed through the chloroplast membrane of a plant. And so we thought about cells and cell walls as boundaries, and how much of us is flow, what it means to have passages that slow things down and yet flow through. And that just really became a theme of our explorations from then on. And so I'd like to read a poem from this book called Oracles. It touches on some of the themes people have mentioned today. Though the gods have the power of speech, more often they choose a flower or plant, elder leaves pressed on a blotter, or spring buds emerging from a winter stem. These messages they send, so ordinary we usually miss them. Uneasy laughter and lightness, or legs casually crossed and touching, the way a serpentine dike blends seamlessly into bedrock, or the way two possible lovers move, starting and stopping, passing and pausing on an April trail. The subtlest oracles are always the most obvious. Seeing what's clearly in front of us, the most difficult. A butterfly hatching from a ruptured dream, or a splintered tree rooting in the soil where it fell. That those we've left endure or falter does not mean we must also. The poison that bit us is also our medicine. It is well to name things as they are. Like that swampy Cree girl they called dries things out. When they found her sitting by the stream, a dragonfly on each palm, all three drying together in the sun. The gods' whispers are never commands, more like the place a steep trail has collapsed, and sunlight offers the understory a second chance. So, I loved that about him. I loved his humor. I loved his choice in people. And a bunch of you are here, and I'm really grateful to have spent part of my life knowing Dale. Thank you.
David Presti.
Let's see, I first met Dale around 1997 or so at a gathering in Oakland at a home of mutual friends. At least one of whom is here. And I've been told he'd written an interesting book on plants, and my memory of him at this gathering was that he was a witty guy. And then I may have met him again somewhere else in the Bay Area, but the next meeting that I clearly remember was at Burning Man in 1998. And it was my first year at Burning Man, and it was Dale's second, I believe. And we crossed paths there, and I had mentioned that I had taken a look at his book. I hadn't bought one yet. It seemed too weird. And, but I'd taken a look at it and it looked intriguing, and I was thinking of developing this class at the University of California in Berkeley, where I worked, and a class on the neurobiology of psychoactive chemicals from a botanical and historical perspective. And that it might be interesting to use his book as a text. And so he pulls one out right there on the ply-in, autographs it, and gives it to me. So I took it home, and I read it. And a couple of years later, in 2000, I started the class. and I used Pharmacopoeia as the text. Had about 100 students in it, and I continued to teach the class when Pharmacodynamics and Pharmacognosis were published. I avidly read those and incorporated them into the mix, and so I've taught the class now annually for 18 years. It has 650 students in it now, and every year, and I use Dale's books, and it's such a privilege to introduce so many thousands of Berkeley undergraduates over the years to this material, and by extension, many other people through them. And there's an interview that Dale gave in the Los Angeles Times about 15 years ago where he talks about getting kicked out of UC Santa Barbara because of things that we've heard about. And he says in there, he said, this would have been in the mid-1960s, and he commented that the dean, he was kicked out by the dean, and that something about deans and police bring out his eloquence. And so now flash forward about 50 years, and the executive dean of the College of Letters and Science at UC Berkeley, where I work, sends out a letter. Oh, by the way, this is the book he gave me to play. And here's the letter from the executive dean. It goes out to thousands of donors to Berkeley, praising Dale's book. Because in this letter they're highlighting these, what they call their signature discovery classes, and my class happens to be one, and they interviewed some students in the class, and then they quoted the students praising Dale's book. This is a very high-level dean, probably a higher level than the one that kicked him out of Santa Barbara. So, so what are the chances of that? I mean, could that have been oraculated in some way? So the books about plants and plant medicines and drugs and pharmacology, many have been written, many more will continue to be written. And these books, the Pharmako Trilogy, are really special. You know that, and they're really, really uniquely special. They will live a century from now, if we haven't gone through, if we're not post-collapse, we will, still know these books, and maybe even if we are, have become procles, we will know the books. As we all know, and is so well represented up here in the schoolhouse, his artistic prowess was just extraordinary. And not only his writing, but his painting, his jewelry, his talking sticks, the magical instruments that form bridges to the spirit world, the place where songs come from. And, how could one person create so much truly visionary material? It helps to have a lovely muse and to live in a place that they call Mantis Hill. And mantis, the insect, of course, but it was through Dale that I learned the etymology of mantis, a prophet, a seer, one who divines, one who oraculates. And Dale called it dimensional smuggling, carrying things back across the portal, gifts for this world. And it was the messenger, the trickster, like Hermes before him or Coyote. His geographically, and meteorologically rigorous dystopian but profoundly hopeful novel, The Great Bay, which several of us have already had conversations here about. This really needs to be a movie. We've even picked the directorial team potentially. The Wachowskis. The Wachowskis should do this. So if any of you have connections to the Wachowskis, put it out there. A deceptively simple-looking and amazingly deep reverie on chance and divination, the language of birds. Essays on economics, money, stained glass, American history, Nevada County history, that embody the highest levels of scholarship. His dramatic productions, some written down and published, others experienced only through performances. Drawings of Bodhidharma, the legendary first patriarch of Chan and Zen, that evoke the work of the ancient masters. And it's really remarkable how much Bodhidharma looks like Dale. And it's true. And his many poems, the poems on fire and metal and lizards and cats and consciousness and atoms and rocks and the fundamental equations of physics. When I read Dale's poem on the Maxwell equations, these beautiful equations of electromagnetism, I read it at a public poetry reading at the UC Berkeley Library several years ago. And I was approached afterward by an esteemed professor of astronomy, one of the guys who had discovered dark energy, actually. And he was so impressed with the poem, he wanted to get a copy of it before it was even published and to share it with the students in his class. And the thread, through all of this is pharmakon, medicine and poison, poison and medicine. And that everything is a poison, everything is a medicine, even the Maxwell equations. And it's a really powerful teaching. And another thread that runs through everything that Dale did and continues to do are circles of community. He wrote, "I can't think of any part of our praxis more crucial than the circle." Community, society, right here. And another phrase, blessings from the universe for all. Thank you, Dale, for all those gifts.
That's not the first academic I've met today in the Dale Admiration Circle. Andrew Shelley.
Nice to see everybody here today. A guy walks into a bar, walks over to a table where a friend is sitting, lays down a bandana on the table, and arranges 5 mushrooms in order from smallest to larger. He looks at his friend and says, "What can you tell me about these mushrooms?" His friend says, "Look like they're the same mushroom and you've arranged them from smallest to largest or youngest to oldest." The man deftly picks up 3 of them and says, "These 3 are delicious to eat. The other 2 will kill you. They will punch holes in your liver and you will have a miserable death that takes 2 weeks." This is not a joke. This is really more a story of friendship. I met Dale through magic. Magic, if you could define it as being effects that are brought about at a distance, because as a young person, I started drinking Osceola root beer long before I met Dale. I used to go into Ma Revolutions down in Berkeley and go home with 4-packs or 6-packs or whatever they had of Osceola. I finally did meet Dale at a Primitive Arts Institute event, and we became good friends and began to swap visits. I was living at the time in the Santa Cruz Mountains, and I would come up to see Dale here on the Ridge, and he would come down to see me outside the town of Felton. And when his years on the Ridge came to an end and he decided he needed to go back to school, he chose UC Santa Cruz. My partner, Christine, and I were living on a piece of land that had a spare cabin, and we offered it to Dale, and he came down there and spent, I think, about a year in the cabin before bringing his family down and settling on Myrtle Street, where Maurice still lives. Dale would come home from classes late often and bring little tinctures for us to try. He introduced me to B&B, Benedictine and brandy, chartreuse, both the yellow and the fiery green sort, and Frangelico, which was made of hazelnuts. And I had learned to trust him. That little event with the mushrooms allowed me to put myself into his hands and try whatever he came up with, which over the years included absinthe and salvias and various things. He went to school and he somehow made friends with an interesting professor down at Santa Cruz, really a sort of shaman named Norman O'Brown, who loathed sycophants and loathed people who wanted something from him. He was really a shaman in a world that wanted gurus, and somehow Dale got close to this very prickly man, and I think getting close to Brown helped Dale find an interesting way to compose what eventually became his trilogy of the Pharmako books, which are full of voices. One day he came to me and he said, you know, I've written this book and I think maybe, well, would you like to read it? And I said, of course I would. And he handed me a manuscript and I took it home. It was Pharmako Poeia, the first volume of the trilogy. And I read it, and really, I think for the first time in my life, my heart burst open with pride at what a friend of mine had accomplished. And I went to Dale and I said, Dale, this is an unbelievable contribution. I've never read anything like this. I can't tell you how astounded I am that I would know somebody who would create a manuscript like this. However, it is full of ethnography. It is full of alchemy, it is full of chemistry, it is full of botany, it's got poetry in it, it's got many, many voices, a multiplicity of voices. There's pungent brevity and skillful verbalisms, but there are contradictory voices, there are contrary voices, and nobody's going to keep track of all of this unless you document who's saying it. You've really got to make citations. And I looked Dale in the eye, and he had that little gleam of mischief that he often had. And when the book came out, it had no citations, no documentation. And I was wrong, and he was right. I'm so glad to hear that 650 undergraduates now can read it without, you know, proper scholarly documentations. I want to read just a little bit to hear his voice from this book, The Language of Birds, that has been mentioned twice here, which is about prophecy and divination and chance. Reading signs is not the path of happiness. We kill the messenger. It was a capital offense to prophesy the death of the emperor. Tiresias was blinded, Phineas also, Amphilochus slain, Prometheus chained to a lonely rock. Macharomancy, divination by knives or swords. Maculomancy, divination from the shape and placement of birthmarks. Margaritomancy, divination by heating and roasting pearls. Nephelomancy, divination by appearance of clouds. Oculomancy, divination by observing the eye. Onomatomancy, divination by polishing fingernails. Osteomancy, divination from bones. Philorodomancy, divination by clapping rose petals between the hands. Rhapsodomancy, divination by a book of poetry. We defy augury. Alexander went to Delphi before beginning his conquests of the East. The oracle was closed, there being only a few days each month when the Pythonist did consultations. Alexander pressed his case several times, but the priestess was firm. Alexander grabbed her by the hair and began dragging her down the stairs to the adytum. The Pythoness agreed to perform a consultation and added, Alexander, you are invincible. Alexander immediately let go of her, thanked her for the consultation, and departed. As some of you know, to his death. And luck is connected with wildness. Mana. Coyote has mana, but screws up anyway, thus ensuring that nothing goes according to plan. Coyote is kind of like chance. Surely, Professor Bohr asked a visitor to the physicist's country cottage, you do not really believe that that horseshoe over your door brings luck. No, answered Bohr, I certainly do not believe in superstition. But I have heard that horseshoes bring good luck even to those who do not believe in them. A few of those voices Dale was so good at. You know, Dale's last book, at least the last one that I saw that came into print, was called Geistertanz, German for ghost dance. And on January 11th, he evidently, in a ghost dance state, dictated a little something for me to Laura. And Laura lovingly wrote them down and mailed them in a card to me. And I just kept the words in order and rearranged the lines. So this is a ghost dance song from Dale Pendell. I'm glad this didn't stretch out past twilight. If we can still help each other, and I think we can, let's. Dale, I love you, man, wherever you are, whatever you're working on. It's going to be good.
I'm Dale Pendell. I'm a writer and a poet. Recently I've completed a trilogy on a poetic history and guide to usage of the whole family of psychoactive plants, from inebriants to stimulants to hallucinogens. You don't have to fear these substances. They have been well experimented with now, not only in indigenous peoples for thousands of years, but here in the United States by 3 generations of explorers now. They're not against America. They're not against the old way of life. They're affirming. These people who experiment with them tend to be good citizens. They tend to help. They're people you'd want to have around you, helping you. And let's stop arresting them and let them out of jail and start living together again. That's the strength of our country that I want to see restored. I was complaining to Gary Snyder one day that everyone was trying to restrict use of psychedelics just for their particular group. The psychiatrist wanted to have control, that they could dispense them. Other group, I said, hey, everybody's trying to say that they're just for them. And Gary goes, they're right. They should be reserved for the poets. Albert Hofmann, at his 100th birthday, I was privileged to be able to go and deliver a poem I wrote for Albert on the making of Legalized, Das Mutterkorn, to him at his 100th birthday. And anyway, at his closing speech, his vision was that LSD would be dispensed in state-operated clinics. Now that is so alien to us and our experience. But what I took from it was that there are governments, countries, where people are not so thoroughly alienated from their government that such a thing is thinkable. State-operated clinics dispensing LSD. Interesting thought. I think the first thing to do is to call for a truce in the war on drugs and a prisoner exchange. We don't have anybody to exchange, but the exchange should go on anyway. Release the drug prisoners. A lot of people are doing exceedingly long sentences, 20, 30-year sentences for LSD. That's the crime. That's the crime of this generation, that so many people are behind bars for exploring their own consciousness. It would have been unthinkable to the framers of the Constitution that freedom of speech did not, that exploring one's own consciousness needed specific protection. That would have been unthinkable to them. And here we have these people on the Supreme Court who claim to be, I don't know what, strict interpreters, original, how from original interpretation they get that, well, yeah, that gives the federal government the right to prosecute drugs even if the states say it's okay. I don't know. It shows the farce and the hollowness of their claims of strict interpretation. It's no such thing. It's a strict interpretation only when it suits them. So we need to stop putting people in prison. That's the first thing. And once we stop doing that and let the people out who are already in, maybe we can come up with some kind of gradual, rational way to deal with these things.